Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm joined on the podcast today by Linda Kass, author of the new novel, Bessie. Bessie is a tender, sensitive, and well-researched exploration of the inner life. Sorry, I screwed that up. I'll just start over and then I'll correct it. I'm joined on the podcast today by Linda Kass, author of the new novel, Bessie. Best-selling writer Kristen Harmel wrote about the novel. Bessie is a tender, sensitive, and well-researched exploration of the inner life of a legendary beauty who was fighting personal battles the world never saw. Linda, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. Glad
Absolutely.
to be
Well,
here.
if someone hasn't yet heard about your novel, Bessie, how would you describe the novel?
Well, I would tell them that I have written a fictional portrait of the early life of Bess Meyerson. And for those who don't know who Bess Meyerson was, she was the daughter of poor Russian immigrants. She lived in the Bronx. She was musically talented. And she rose to gain the title in 1945 of Miss America. But this is not a book about beauty pageants per se. It's really about a young girl, a young woman who struggles to find her voice and finds it. And it's a coming of age of this rather iconic figure who became a rather iconic figure later on. I deal with her early life because that's not, um, uh, as well known. Bess Meyerson went on to do a lot of things. She was part of the emerging broadcast television. She was on game shows that were so popular in the 50s and then became very, very prominent in New York politics under several mayors. And, but my book doesn't go there. My book really looks at her as a young girl and blossoming into a beautiful woman who ends up in this beauty pageant, not someone who was necessarily, um, aspiring to this at all, because things that were coveted in her life were not beauty, but rather they were sort of achievement in education and music and that sort of thing.
Well, do you remember the impetus for deciding to write a novel about Bess Meyerson's younger life?
Yeah, Jeff, I do. It actually began just before COVID. I had turned in my manuscript for my last novel, A Richie Boy, and both of my last two novels were the time period was the World War II time period. So I was extremely familiar with the world and this country at that time and the sentiment at that time. And I was certainly had heard of Bess Meyerson. I knew she had been named Miss America, and I knew she was a Jewish woman, and that she had been the only. Actually, there's never been another Jewish woman who was won the crown of Miss America. So I knew these things, but what happened was I was reading an article. I believe maybe a book came out about Miss America somewhere around February of 2020. And written on the page, as I was reading this article, they always mention Bess Meyerson. She became such a famous Miss America. So they were always the former Miss America, Bess Meyerson. It was always followed her wherever she went. So it mentions, of course, Bess Meyerson because this was an article about Miss America. And on the page, right in front of me, was September 8th, 1945, the day, the evening that she won the crown. And that was 6 days after the close of World War II. And uh, we had just weeks after we had bombed Japan. The images were coming out just then of when Eisenhower let the reporters and photographers into concentration camps, and the images of the Holocaust victims was just coming out. and I understood the sentiment, the many isms that existed at that time,
Hmm.
okay, that exist today. And it just struck me to the point where I went to the library to get some biographies about Bess Meyerson because I was just so shocked that she was named Miss America at that time. And so as I read these biographies, I decided to focus on her early life because that became the most interesting part of her her development, her moral development. And so I took those touch points of her early life and dramatized it.
Well, given what you given what you just said, and here I'm not completely, familiar with the history, but I just wanted to ask you. I mean, given what you said about this time period, um, I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, when she participated in uh, the Miss America pageant, was it known that she was Jewish? Because I know that, some Jewish families, do, over time have changed their last name, et cetera. I'm just curious about that, given
Yeah.
what you said
Yeah.
about the
Yeah.
time period and
Yes.
feelings.
Yes, she, there, she got into this contest and, it became clear from her last
Right.
name, Meyerson, that she was Jewish, actually. At least it became evident to the pageant director, Lenora Slaughter. And Bess Meyerson was even asked to change her
Interesting.
name and this happened really during the Miss New York competition when Bess Meyerson first met Lenora Slaughter. Lenora started, talking to her and obviously had a sense that this woman who was so talented, she was a piano prodigy. She also was her talent competition was also playing a Gershwin piece on the flute, Summertime. And she had a sense, Lenora Slaughter had a sense that Bess Meyerson could win Miss New York, and then she would become a contestant in Miss America, and she could potentially win Miss America. So she began to suggest to her that perhaps she might have change her name. And 20 at the time, 21-year-old Bess Meyerson had the courage to say, no, I don't want to do that. No one's going to know it's me, so I'm going to keep my name. And she ended up struggling somewhat because it became known through sponsors once she won. Before she won, frankly, there were judges that there were people that didn't want her to win,
Hmm.
that knew she was Jewish. So she faced that, and she faced that as she had the title and sponsors backing out, really. So it was a factor, and it did exist, and she surmounted it, and she found toward the end of my book, at least, she found a place for her voice to speak out and speak out for social justice, and which also was very appealing to me to
Sure.
write about her.
You talked about the that she was well known a lot of times, more so the things that she did after she won the pageant later in the 50s, as you said, participating in game shows,
Mhm.
etc. So I guess my question is, what kind of research did you do for your novel, specifically looking at this period in her life, even though, as you said earlier, this is a fictionalized account?
Yeah, sure. Well, I read 3 biographies of her to begin with, and, one in particular, was written in conjunction with her, I would say. There were lots of parts of it that her actual voice was there in the book, and she was actually interviewed and talking. So I got a sense of her voice, even though it wasn't her
Hmm.
young voice as a, let's say 15 or 20-year-old, it was her voice and it gave me a sense of who she was. Um, I also found a phenomenal book that was all about New York during World War II. And she lived in the Bronx. She took her piano lessons later on on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. She attended a wonderful school for musically and artistically talented students that she was in their second class. It was the pride and joy and legacy of Mayor Fiorella LaGuardia, called the High School of Music and Art. So she, this whole area, of New York, it was important for me to understand it, and this book that really was all about just New York during that time was very helpful to me in helping make ground me in it, and allow me to make the book as authentic as I could for that time period. I found a book, also, I'm a
Hmm.
former journalist, so I love research and I know how to find things. And I found a book that was actually written by the first principal of the High School of Music and Art, and that was a significant part of her life. And to be able to read a book about the school helped me ground again. Writing about her in that school, I could imagine it so much more and make it so much more real for the reader. I similarly found a very thin book about Hunter College, where she went to college as a music major. So and there was a book about Miss America pageant, and certainly a lot of other sources that I found online, that helped me tell this story, and understand that sort of time period
That's
that she was
great.
living.
Can you tell us what was your original writing journey that led you to writing your first novel and getting it published?
Well, I was really inspired. So I mentioned I have I began in magazine journalism. I have a graduate degree in journalism from Ohio State, and I started in magazine journalism, and uh, worked in communications for some time in the middle in there. And about 15 years ago, I met someone who's become really a good friend, who's a wonderful novelist, memoirist, and is a professor of creative writing at the Ohio State University creative writing program. And I came across him about 15 years ago, when I was trying to put together a family, just for my own family. A sort of a family memoir, in celebration of an important anniversary of my parents. I'm a first generation American, and each of my parents had very they were both
Hmm.
European immigrants. And my mother came from Eastern Poland, the part that is now Ukraine, and came here after the war. My father was born in Vienna, and he and his parents miraculously got affidavits in 1938, and he came to this country and eventually joined the U.S. Army and became a Ritchie boy, which is really the precursor of the CIA. Became military intelligence, but they were immigrants who understood the language and the culture of the enemy. So I had these parents who actually they probably really didn't talk that much about their early life, but I was a journalist and I was sort of the family historian, and I wanted to understand from where I came. So I interviewed my parents a long, long time ago. To give you an idea, I typed up my notes. I did it on audio tape, and I typed up my notes on a typewriter. And I put those notes in a drawer. And so the time came about 15 years ago, and I wanted to put together a creative kind of gift for my parents that brought their histories, together in a creative way. So I met this individual. His name's Lee Martin, and I was talking to him about this project of mine and my writing background, and I just needed some help to know how to really do it creatively. And he ended up talking me into taking. I took 3 quarters of creative writing at Ohio State. I already had a master's degree. I did not, decide I'm gonna
Right.
go get an MFA here. I did not need any or want any new degrees, but I did decide, I was hooked, really, and started writing, fiction thanks to Lee, and did that pivot. And it was when my daughter, was on she did a, travel
Hmm.
abroad through college, and she was in Berlin and had a fall break. My husband and I went to visit her, and she wanted to go to Poland and to, Vienna. So it was, really coming back from that trip that I could not write anything that I was working on, and I had to go back and really I was inspired to tell my mother's story, but it was definitely fiction. I mean, I took touch points from her life, from her history that I knew, and I, created a violin prodigy who lived through World War II in Eastern Poland, and was able to tell that actual history after a lot of research. I learned quite a bit that I didn't know in researching that book. But that was my first novel. It was called Tassa's Song, and so it wasn't inspired by my mother's actual life, but it was not my mother's exact story. And and then, I was hooked, and I wrote that book, and then I started working on, this other novel, A Richie Boy, and it became a novel in stories. I started with just writing stories, of different things that I knew about, a nugget, and that nugget became 20 pages of a story, a short story, and several of the stories had been published in literary journals before I compiled them all together and actually pulled them in a linear way so it would seem more novel-like, but it was really novel and stories told by different characters with one main character who, uh, was prominent or in the mid or background of stories, but it was all about this particular character, Richie Boy.
What was your writing process for Bessie? Did you plan the novel extensively before you began writing it, or did you just have a general idea? How did that work for you?
Well, um, I tend to like to have, a sense of my beginning and the end, whether it's an image or whether it's a scene, and that tends to ground me, and, so I wouldn't say I outline, but what I do is I begin with
Hmm.
research enough. And I think through in my I do a lot of thinking in my head, and when finally there's just so much that I'm thinking about, I start putting things on paper, on in the computer. I start, sketching characters or thinking through, scenes, and those things I keep developing them, and eventually I develop them to a degree that I can, sketch out almost, where it's going, vaguely, and that changes as I'm writing. But what does stay the same tends to be this beginning and ending, image or scene, for my books.
What writing advice would you offer for those who are working on their own stories or novels?
Um, I would basically say I'm a road cyclist. I've been doing
Hmm.
that for a while. Love to get on my bike and ride out in the country. I have a lot of friends that do that here in, Columbus, Ohio, where I am. And as have ridden 100 miles, um, and I now don't ride 100 miles at once, but, I had 5 years in a row. I do this big cycling event that you do over a day or 2 days, and, I've done 5 century rides over 1 day. So, I would say to do that, I wouldn't just start cycling. I would train. And so I would say that same advice to someone who's gonna write a novel. You really do have to train. You have to learn the craft, and I think the best way to learn the craft is to read. Read a lot. I read a whole lot. I read a lot more now than I even did in the beginning, and it's made me a better writer. So I would say read a lot and then, you know, just start writing and take it in small pieces too, uh, yeah, I think sometimes it can be very overwhelming to think that you're writing a book because a
Right.
book is so big. So I know that for my first book, I thought about writing a chapter. Let's just get a chapter done, and take it one chapter at a time. And then after, every book you start is a different book. So you're still facing that blank page and that big one book you have to do. So then what you do is you think, I did this before. I'm going to be able to do it again,
Yeah.
And so that keeps you going. So that's kind of the advice I always tell people because I do talk to a lot of young writers or, just people who, when they hear, yeah, you've written a book, they want to talk to you about their challenges. And I always want to try to talk and help.
Have you started thinking about or working on another novel yet?
Bessie was my COVID book, I'd say. So I'm someone who, I own a bookstore. And so I have a day job. And during COVID, I would say that both business and social life was much quieter. And so I was able to get that book done probably more quickly than I would normally. I need to have space to to create a book, to imagine the fiction that's necessary for these books. And I do have an idea, Jeff. I'm not, is this going to be a book? I mean, I'm not far enough along yet to tell you that, but I'd like to explore, um, it tends to be something that my mind goes to and it doesn't let go. That's really how I decide I'm gonna tackle a topic because you're committing yourself to several years of working on something. So you
Sure.
want to make sure you're really committed to it. And I'd say that the time period I'm going to jump forward. It's still going to be historical fiction, but I feel like I want to jump forward a couple of decades. And I'm very, very intrigued with the time period around 1969, 1970. Um, and, perhaps looking at a public high school um, in the Midwest and exploring really an ecosystem that has, kind of that feeling of, you know, um, I guess you could say that feeling that you have at that time period of life where everything and anything is possible, along with the backdrop of a very serious historical backdrop, really at that time, because as you know, it was a time
Sure.
during Vietnam. It was a time, during there was a lot of racial tension during that time. There was just we think of the world we're in right now, which is quite tenuous, and it seems like it never was this bad, and yet it was. So this is another time period that I would like to
That
explore.
sounds great. What books, fiction or nonfiction, have you read recently that you enjoyed?
Ugh, wow. Well, I as a bookseller, I'm now reading more than ever. I probably read a book every 3 to 5 days, just because I kind of will start early in the morning and I'll spend a couple hours really, let's say 6 to 8 in the morning and just read. When you do that regularly, you get through a lot of books. And I just finished one book just this morning, actually, that I love. It's not. It came out. I believe it came out last fall. Um, uh, 2022, and I think the paperback just came out last this month. And the book is Signal Fires by Danny Shapiro. And it's really one of the most poignant novels that I've read in a long time. It begins with a car crash, but yet the telling of the story is way quieter. It's really about the consequences of a long hidden lie. A real evocative story that is a meditation about memory, about time, about the long lasting consequences of family secrets, and about really the interconnectedness of people. It's really a tremendous book. I was blown away by it, frankly. Both the writing, but also the way it was structured, because it wasn't linear, and it really deftly went from different time periods and did not lose me at all. And yet, you know, propulsive in the way it told the story. It was a wonderful story. I've also read The Postcard. I don't know if you've heard about that book. It's called a novel, but I almost feel like it feels like a memoir, because the author, who's a French novelist named Anne Barrest, it was translated for us
Hmm.
here in this country, um, but it's a moving account of a Jewish family who were almost completely wiped out at Auschwitz in 1942. But what's so unusual, the book is so beautifully written. It's told like an unfolding mystery about these four people that Anne, the author, and the main character receives in a postcard the names of these four people that turned out to be her relatives, and it's like an investigation, and it's really beautifully written. I've read, what else have I recently read? I just finished Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. Loved it. Um, Ann Patchett's books. I love all her books. Fellow
Right.
bookseller, author. This book is taking place during COVID, and main character is sheltering in place on the family's cherry orchard in northern Michigan, and her 20-something daughters, are begging her during this time as they're picking cherries, to tell them about her brief career as an actor, and particularly her time in the 80s spent as part of a summer theater troupe uh, in a rural town called Tom Lake, which is the name of the book, where she shared the stage and was briefly romantically involved with a famous actor who became a famous actor, and the whole thing is really, kind of. Uh, the place she was in was Our Town, and Our Town is very much by Thornton Wilder is very much part of the way Anne tells this whole story. So it's a great
That sounds
book.
great. Well, as you mentioned, you are the founder and owner of a bookstore, Gramercy Books in Columbus, Ohio. Can you tell us? I mean, I know it's a very broad question, but what is your experience of running an independent bookstore in 2023?
Oh boy, well, we are. It's wonderful. It's bookstores, indie bookstores become the heart of their communities, and they're so important. And you know, I always have people come and say to me, "Yeah, how are you operating, as an indie bookstore? I mean, with Amazon." And I said, "What are you talking about? We're in totally different businesses. Amazon is a transactional business, and independent bookstores are experiential. You're coming into a bookstore and you're browsing and you're connecting with booksellers who, you know, guide you to a path of discovery, of a book maybe you didn't even go in there and think you were looking for. We do a
Hmm.
lot of events at the bookstore. I always wanted it to be a bookstore that featured authors, and so we're small, but we do about a book event, an author event every single week.
Wow, that's great.
So, yeah, and so it becomes really a place where readers and writers can interact. and connect with one another. And it's become a community hub. And it's really, it feels really good. We have a wonderful team there. And I think the community is so supportive of us, and we're so
That's
appreciative of
great.
them.
Where can people find you online if they want to learn more about you and your new novel, Bessie?
Well, I have an author website, www.lindacass, that's with a K, lindacass.com. And, they can also find me, on our bookstore, website as well. We have our story up there, and, I write all the blogs for the bookstore, and that is www. Gramercy with one M, Gramercy Books, Bexley, Bexley.com. So those are the two places where I can be
That's
found
wonderful.
online.
And if someone is interested in listening to this, can they order books from your bookstore online? Okay,
Sure. Yes,
wonderful. So
absolutely.
I'll have links to that in the show notes as well. Well, again, we've been speaking to Linda Kass, author of the new novel, Bessie. The book is available now, so go buy a copy. And Linda, thanks for doing this interview.
Thanks, Jeff. It's really been great
Wonderful.
talking to you.